Now that we've found our inspiration, what I suggest we do before we even begin the whole sketching process is go into a little bit more detail on the anatomy of type, some of the basics. So the first thing I like to go over is the difference between the words typeface versus font. So a typeface is a particular set of glyphs or sorts, which is basically an alphabet and its corresponding accessories such as numerals and punctuation that share a common design. So for example, Helvetica is a really well-known typeface, and a font is a particular set of glyphs within that typeface. So 12-point Helvetica is a font and 10-point Helvetica is a separate font. And the same goes for different weights, like 14-point Helvetica Bold is a different font than a 14-point Helvetica Light. They are different fonts, but they are part of the same typeface. So I like to look at typefaces almost like a family. I also like to share more information on the history behind some of this because it kind of relates to some of the words and themes and ideas that you hear when we talk about these concepts. So the reason these are different is because historically, when a page of text was laid out by hand before printing, the organization of the thousands of small pieces of metal letters, and sometimes wood letters as well, was really essential. So for centuries, a printer or a typesetter would set type letter by letter from a type case. The type was stored in a shallow wooden drawer, and these were called job cases, and then these were all divided into small compartments for each letter, for each numeral, for each ligature, punctuation mark, and any varying widths of spacing. In the United States, the most popular style of type case was the California job case. In this, the layout of glyphs was organized so that a typesetter could really quickly find the correct glyph from memory, and it's almost similar to typing on a keyboard, only it's a little bit slower. Older styles of type cases organized the capital letters in a separate case from the minuscules, so the smaller letters, the lowercase letters. And the capital letter case was placed above the drawer of the minuscules, which is where we get the terms uppercase and lowercase. Now, the next kind of helpful thing to keep in mind is the difference between types of fonts and classifications. So serif and sans serif are two of the most popular type classifications, and serifs are semi-structural details or really small decorative flourishes on the ends of some of the strokes that make up letters and symbols. An example of this would be the Times New Roman font. Sans serif, on the other hand, does not have these details or flourishes. They're a bit more linear, more modern, and you don't see those additional decorative elements on the lines. A display font is a broad category of fonts that are designed for short form and often large format applications such as billboards or posters, logo types, headlines, or headings in magazines or websites, and book covers. Display fonts transcend styles, so they can be a serif font, slab serif, script, sans serif, and so on. A handwritten font, on the other hand, are fonts that look like they were written by hand, usually with a pen or a marker. Within the broad category, you'll find a range of different styles that kind of reflects the variations and subtle differences that you'll find in actual handwriting. The difference between script and handwritten fonts, though, is based on the fact that script fonts are decorative or very calligraphic in nature, so they look like calligraphy, while true handwritten fonts reflect the penmanship one might see in a letter. A monospace font, which is also known as a fixed pitch or fixed width or non-proportional font, is a font whose letters and characters each occupy the same amount of horizontal space. This contrasts the variable width fonts where the letters and spacing might have different widths. Monospace fonts are customary on things like typewriters and for typesetting computer code. Script fonts are fonts that are created to capture the flourish and artistry of traditional hand lettering and calligraphy. Script fonts are usually really decorative in nature, and most should be used like one would use a display font, which is to make a statement rather than set text. Typically, it's really difficult to read script fonts when they are set in paragraph form, so usually you want to use them for call-outs and specific areas you want to make a statement with. These types of fonts are really popular with stationery, logo types, branding, and poster design, and they can be paired really nicely with a range of other font styles. So now that we understand the different classification of fonts and we understand a bit of the history of fonts, I want to talk more about kind of the nuances within the letters of your typefaces and fonts. So the weight of a particular font is the thickness of the character, and how those character outlines are relative to their height. A typeface may come in many different weights, from ultra light, which are really, really thin, to extra bold or black, which are really thick. 4 to 6 weights are not unusual when it comes to a family of typefaces, and a few typefaces have as many as a dozen different weights. The most common weights and styles are regular, bold, and italics. The style of a font is usually connected to an angle, so it's either upright or slanted. So the normal style is usually upright, or Roman as we call it, and it will display by default. Many font families have an italics version of a font, and the italic font style of a typeface has been slanted to the right and has had other changes made to the letter glyphs to make them slightly different. It approaches a more handwritten cursive style, and sometimes the characters may even connect. Oblique font faces, on the other hand, are found in many sans serif typefaces, and their characters are also slanted, but unlike italics, the glyphs themselves are not changed. Oblique fonts are not true italics because they lack the change in letter shapes, which is part of that whole definition of italic. Now, let's talk more about anatomy of our letters and type when we're creating them. So we're going to look at this in more detail when we're working within Affinity Designer, right before we jump into pulling all of our letters and glyphs. But I just want to kind of give you a highlight, and I don't include everything in here, just some of the more key important things that we're going to need for this particular class. So the baseline is where the letters sit. We utilize that within our guideline. These first 3 areas, the baseline, the cap height, and the X height, we utilize these in this guideline that I gave you guys for your sketches. The cap height is the distance from the baseline to the top of the capital letter. The X height, on the other hand, is located in between the baseline and the cap height, and it is the height of the body of the lowercase letters. Then there is the bowl, which is the curved part of a character that encloses the circular or curved parts of some letters, like D and B and an uppercase B. And then, as we highlighted, there's serifs. These are the slight projections finishing off a stroke of a letter in certain typefaces. Then there's the descender, which is the longest point on a letter that falls beyond the baseline. The stem is the base of a letter, similar to the stem of a flower. The spine is the curvy body of the letter S, and only the letter S. It gets its own term because the spine can almost be vertical or mostly horizontal depending on the typeface. And then there's the ascender. This is the portion of a letter that extends above the mean line of a font. Basically, it's taller than the font's X height, like in the lowercase letter B. So these are some additional parts of a letter that you might want to keep in mind since we are working in uppercase format. If we look at this S, we see the beak, which is the top point of the letter S. That spine is that curve that we talked about earlier. And then if we look at the uppercase B, we'll see both of those curvatures in the letter. We can call them also the upper lobe and the lower lobe, and then the space in between them is the waist. And then if we look at the G here, this is called the throat. And then if we look at our Q, we have the counter, which is that center space, and then the tail. And then if we look at the letter E, it's similar with the letter F as well. And the little elements coming out of the side of the letter are arms. And then the center element to create the H is called the crossbar. So in addition to the variables like cap height, X height, and baseline when it comes to your type and overall design work, there's 3 additional variables that I want you to keep in mind. We'll talk more about this when we're working in glyphs. So the first I want to look at is tracking. This is the horizontal spacing between your letters. And then there is leading, which is the vertical space between the lines of letters. So if you look at your letter forms in sentence format, it's the lines between your sentences. And then there's kerning, which is the spacing between the pairs of letters. And we're going to work a lot with the spacing between these letters when we're in glyphs. So these are just some additional elements that you should keep in mind. So now that we have a better idea of the anatomy of type and different elements to keep in mind, let's get started on sketching.